Hello, and welcome to another episode of Reason at Large. I'm Craig Biddle. Today, I want to answer a question I received from Amy, but I've received this from, in some form or another, from several people over the years. And the question is this. I have said that people should be intolerant of Islam. And how do I square that with the right to freedom of religion? So I say you shouldn't be intolerant of Islam, but people have a right to freedom of religion. How do we reconcile these views? And this is a great question. It's rich, and it's going to require some clarification on several points. The main thing we need to understand here is the difference between respecting rights and being tolerant, because contrary to widespread confusion, these are not the same thing. They're essentially different, and they really need to be separated mentally and conceptually in the way that we use words. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between these two. Now, respecting rights means leaving people free to act on their judgment, leaving people free to believe what they choose to believe and to act as they see fit, to pursue their goals, and so on, as long as they respect by not violating, as long as they don't violate the rights of others by using force against them. So respecting rights just means leaving people free, refraining from using physical force against them so that they are able to act on their judgment. And this is pretty straightforward. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what rights are, but what it really means to respect rights is simply to leave people free to act on their judgment. Being tolerant of people is very different. Being tolerant does not mean respecting rights. It means refusing to judge people, refusing to morally judge people. And we can see this if we look at an example or two. Suppose I morally condemn someone. Suppose I say, Joe is an evil, despicable racist. And this is true of Joe, what I'm about to say, so that's part of the context here. Joe regards all races other than his own, which is Caucasian. He regards all races, blacks and Asians and every other race other than Caucasian, as morally inferior. He uses the N-word to refer to blacks. He makes fun of Asian people for the shape of their eyes. He just generally acts like a bigoted Neanderthal. And so I loathe Joe. I despise him. I regard him as despicable, and I will have nothing to do with him. And I won't have anything to do with anyone who regards his beliefs or his actions as respectable. So there, I've judged Joe. I've morally condemned Joe. Now, have I violated Joe's rights by doing that? Well, no, of course not. I have not done anything to use force against Joe. He is free to continue being the bigoted moron that he is. I have not stopped him from acting on his judgment. Now, assuming Joe has not, gone after somebody with a baseball bat, gone after some, black or Asian guy with a baseball bat, and tried to beat him, I mean, that's a different story. But as long as Joe is just professing these ideas and using words to make fun of people and the like, he's despicable, and I loathe him and want nothing to do with him. But my saying all of that does not in any way violate his rights. He's still free to act on his judgment. I've done nothing to violate his rights. Have I tolerated Joe? Have I been tolerant of Joe? Well, no, I have not. I've been precisely intolerant of him. I have judged him morally. I have said openly and straightforwardly that I regard him as evil and his actions as evil, and that I won't even have anything to do with him or anyone who regards his views as respectable. So not only have I not been respectful of Joe, I've expressed my utter disrespect for him. And this is what it means to judge somebody morally, is to express your negative view of this person and his ideas and what he does. So I have respected Joe's rights, but I have not been tolerant of him. So you can respect somebody's rights and be intolerant of them at the same time. These are not the same thing. And the problem is that historically the usage of this term has been very vague. John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers did use the words toleration and tolerance to refer vaguely to the idea of respecting people's rights, specifically respecting their rights to freedom of religion. But Locke and the other Enlightenment thinkers had not actually fully formed the concept of rights yet, and their use of the word tolerance in this respect was still at the beginning, sort of the groping stage of what it meant to leave people free, particularly with respect to their conscience, or their freedom of conscience, or freedom of religion. And so the word was used, the word toleration was used in a sort of a vague sense to mean respecting people's religious rights, or rights to freedom of religion. But even John Locke did not regard Catholics, for instance, as properly having freedom of religion, or atheists as properly having freedom of religion. So he didn't even apply the concept of tolerance as though it were actually the fully fleshed out meaning of rights that we now have today, thanks to Ayn Rand. So there is this early usage where toleration or tolerance was used in a way that sort of vaguely meant respecting people's freedom, right to freedom of religion. But language is dynamic. Language can change over time, and in this case, it has. Language can evolve. And there are many instances of this, just to give you two. The word awful used to mean awe-inspiring or admirable, and of course now it means extremely bad or terrible. It has acquired a completely different meaning over time. Likewise, the word nice used to mean unknowing or ignorant. And of course, it doesn't mean that at all now. Nice means pleasant or courteous today. So we can see, if we look at language, even the English language, that it does evolve over time, and a word can change, the meaning of a word can change. And that is what has happened with the word tolerance. The word tolerance used to mean vaguely respecting people's right to freedom of religion, and now it means the refusal to judge, or the refraining of judging, refraining from judging. So why is it that people continue to be confused on this? And the reason is that people have either fallen for or been duped by a fallacy that Ayn Rand called package dealing. And a package dealing is when things that are essentially different are mentally combined into a mental package, a concept, and thus treated as though they were essentially the same when they're not essentially the same. And we have a classic case of that here. You've got respecting people's rights, not using force against them, and refusing to judge people morally, being put into one idea and then used as if those two things were really the same thing, when in fact they're not. And package dealing is really dangerous, because what it does is it throttles your ability to use the word or the concept in question. So when people accept the word tolerance to mean both respecting rights and not judging, which they do, good people don't want to violate rights. So they say to themselves, in effect, well, you know, tolerance is a good thing. It's a virtue. Be tolerant. That's a good way to be. But then the other element of the package deal is still worked into their acceptance of this idea, and so their acceptance of tolerance as a virtue actually precludes them from passing moral judgment against people who deserve to be morally judged and morally condemned. It's interesting to note that tolerance is always used in regard to people doing bad things that we're supposed to put up with. It's never the case that we're supposed to tolerate cultures that respect rights, or that we're supposed to tolerate cultures that raise children rationally without beating them or without, declitterizing young girls or without marrying 6 or 9-year-old girls. The cultures we're supposed to tolerate are always the ones that do these obviously bad things. And that's just an interesting side note, but it goes to the reason that tolerance and the package deal of tolerance is so dangerous. When these ideas are packaged into one word, when respecting rights and refusing to judge people are packaged into one word, the acceptance of that idea with the intention of respecting rights makes one incapable of passing moral judgment when one should pass moral judgment. So let's apply this to Islam. Should we be tolerant of Islam? Well, what does this mean? Dictionary definitions of tolerance today typically are very vague. So they'll say something like, tolerance is the practice of respecting the practices of others even when you disagree with them. So respecting or putting up with the practices of others even when you disagree with them. And some dictionaries will get a little bit more specific and say tolerance consists in respecting the religious practices of others when you disagree with them. Well, what does that mean applied to, say, Islam? Should we respect the Islamic practice of either converting or killing infidels? That's ridiculous. Of course we can't respect that. We can't put up with that. That is an absurd thought. So, but if you accept the idea that we should tolerate Islam, you're going to feel like you shouldn't judge that you shouldn't come down on that idea, that you should put up with it. Should we respect the Islamic practice of killing homosexuals, or men beating their wives, or men marrying 6-year-old girls, or the like? Of course not. This is absurd. And what would it mean to respect these things? And how would that differ from refusing to judge them? You see, refusing to judge and respecting are essentially the same thing. The words respect or put up with that are frequently used in dictionary definitions are vague, but the real meaning of those is the refusal to judge, the refusal to morally judge something. So dictionaries are not clear on these things, and they fail. These kinds of dictionary definitions fail at the purpose of a definition, which is to create a clear, bright line between the things that are supposed to be included in a given category and the things that are supposed to be excluded from that. So tolerance or toleration cannot serve both purposes. It cannot mean both respecting rights and refusing to judge. And given the way that language has evolved, it actually has come to mean refusal to judge. Now, we don't need to try to resurrect the use of tolerance to mean respecting rights, because we have a perfectly good concept for that, respecting rights. When we want to refer to the idea that we should respect the rights of Muslims or anyone else, we should say, yes, we should respect the rights of these people to believe what they want to believe and to act on their judgment, even their religious judgment, as long as that religious judgment does not violate the rights of others. So we should use the concept of rights and the phrase respecting rights in those ways because it's very clear and unequivocal. If we want to talk about the act of refusing to judge, we should either use the concept tolerance, which has in fact come to mean that, or simply use the phrase refusing to judge. So if somebody wants to say, you should not judge Islam, then be straightforward and say you should not judge Islam. And then you can have a discussion about whether you should or should not judge a religion that calls for the murder of non-believers. And that's the way that we need to use these terms if we're going to keep our thinking clear and keep the units that our ideas are supposed to refer to in reality straight and organized in our mind. Now, there are instances in which the word tolerance does not carry any of this moral packaging or moral connotation. And those instances are fine. So, for instance, if I say, I tolerate mushrooms on my pizza, or if someone says, well, I tolerate my husband's snoring, these are not moral issues, because mushrooms on pizza and a husband snoring are not inherently moral issues. I mean, they could, in a certain context, be moral issues, but they're not just inherently moral. matters. They're optional in the sense that if you take or leave the mushrooms, but it's not that big a deal. If you're okay and sort of like mushrooms, but not much, and you will put up with them on your pizza, that's fine. There's no equivocation here on whether you should respect people's rights or judge people. Or whether respecting rights and refusing to judge are the same thing. So there's no need to worry about that kind of usage. Tolerance also has perfectly legitimate usage, non-moral usage in various sciences, in physics and in engineering and in medicine and in biology. So I'm not saying that there are no instances in which the word can't be used to not mean, or to mean something other than, refusing to pass moral judgment. But when tolerance is used as a virtue, when it is used with the idea being this is the right thing to do, you can count on the fact that someone using that term, or someone trying to profit from that usage or benefit from that usage, is trying to get away with either evil himself or with excusing evil on the part of someone else. And so we must not permit that usage to pass us by. We need to use the term respecting rights and rights where it's unequivocal. We need to use the term tolerance, or refusing to judge, where that's clear. And when other people use the word tolerance, we should ask them bluntly and straightforwardly, do you mean by that respecting people's rights, as in not initiating physical force, or do you mean by that we should not judge this person or this idea or this action or this culture? They are not the same thing, and it's really crucial that we keep them separated. Islam is just pure evil. The religion calls for unbelievers, presumably you and certainly me, to be either converted or killed. It calls for the murder of homosexuals. It permits, at least condones, the marrying of men marrying children, 6-year-old children. Thus, it condones child rape. It condones people throwing acid in girls' faces for violating Sharia law. It condones honor killings. It condones all sorts of hideous things. And all of this comes out of the Quran and of seeing Muhammad, the so-called prophet of Islam, as being the ideal role model. So I mean, there's nothing else you can say rationally about Islam other than this is a horrifically evil idea. And if people want to believe it, that's their business. But if they act on the rights-violating tenets of Islam, then not only are they to be morally judged, but they need to be dealt with legally or militarily. Now, I do want to address one other very, very important problem here related to all of this, and that is, why is it that so few people are able to really condemn Islam root and branch? I mean, this religion is just wreaking havoc all over the planet, and now even to some extent in the United States, major extents in the United States. I mean, we had the bombing of the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, and we've had various shootings and other bombings. We just had these wicked brothers bomb marathoners and spectators at the Boston Marathon, and who knows what's coming next. Why are people unable to just categorically condemn and judge Islam as evil? And the reason is that many Westerners are unable to do so because they actually embrace the same root, the same fundamental elements that Islam derives from, or that is the fundamental element of the religion. What is the fundamental element of Islam? What is the one thing that underlies and gives rise to all of the other ideas and policies and practices of the religion? It's the idea that faith is a means of knowledge, that you should have faith that there is an Allah. You should have faith that his will is the moral law. You should have faith that Muhammad is the prophet and that he is the ideal role model, and that his ideas and commands are to be obeyed, and so on. That's where people get the idea. That's why people accept the idea, because they are told that the way that you know these ideas is by means of faith. The fundamental of all three religions, of all three of the major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is the idea that faith is a means of knowledge. And it's not just the means to any old knowledge, it's the means to the most important kind of knowledge, knowledge about what's morally right and wrong. So knowledge about whether God or Allah or Yahweh actually exists, and then knowledge about what He wants us to do, and knowledge about, what's going to happen to us if we don't do what He wants us to do, or if we do what He wants us to do. All of that is to be accepted by means of faith, which is, acceptance of ideas in the absence of any evidence in support of those ideas. That's what faith is. That's what distinguishes it from reason. You accept ideas on reason when there's evidence and logic in support of them, and you accept things on faith when there's no evidence and no logic, but you're allegedly supposed to accept it anyway. That's why we have those two different concepts. So, if it's true that faith is a means of knowledge, and if it's true that faith is a means to the most important kinds of knowledge, knowledge about whether God exists and what we should do, how can a Muslim be wrong about his views about whether Allah exists and about whether, what Allah wants him to do and whether or not he should kill unbelievers? He can't be wrong. If faith is a means to knowledge and he has faith, then he has knowledge, right? And you think of it this way. If faith is a means to knowledge, then faith is a means to knowledge. If somebody has faith that, yes, I just know, not by reason and evidence, but I just know that I'm supposed to kill infidels, how can another advocate of faith, how can another person who says, yeah, well, faith is in fact a means of knowledge, how can he come along and say, oh, well, you got that wrong? What do you mean I got it wrong? I have faith. That means I have knowledge. So when a Muslim thinks, or it's the wrong word there, when a Muslim believes that he has knowledge that he's supposed to kill infidels or marry 6-year-olds or do whatever, to him, based on his acceptance of faith as a means of knowledge, he has knowledge that that's what he is supposed to do. And this idea is supported by and lent credence to by everyone who accepts the idea that faith is a means of knowledge. And there's no getting around this. Christians and Jews cannot get around this fact. This is the fundamental of all religion, is that faith is a means to the most important knowledge of all. And faith is going by just knowing when there's no evidence or logic. I mean, there certainly is no evidence there's no observational reason for killing people who don't believe what you believe. There's no observational data that we can point to that says, this is why homosexuals should be killed, or this is why it's okay for men to marry 6-year-olds, or this is why it's okay for men to beat their wives. None of this has any basis in the facts of reality. To accept any of it, one has to accept it on faith. And if faith is a means of knowledge, you can't be wrong in accepting it. So, the big problem here, bigger than the equivocation involved in the popular usage of tolerance and toleration, the big problem here is that judgment in general is being pushed aside. It's being pushed aside in part because people package together respecting rights and being being tolerant, or refusing to judge, into being tolerant. And so a lot of people just sort of on a subconscious level at least, find themselves uneasy about judging people. They feel like, oh, I should be tolerant and put up with this stuff. But on a more fundamental level, Westerners are unable to judge Islam and to repudiate Islam at its roots, because so many Westerners accept the very same root. So the bottom line is that if we want to win the cultural war against Islam, Westerners have got to come to realize that faith is not a means of knowledge. It is not. Just believing in something does not make it so. And if someone wants to continue to claim that it does, then you are in effect assisting the Muslims who want to kill unbelievers. Faith is not a means of knowledge. Man's only means of knowledge is reason, which means observation, conceptualization based on the things that we perceive in reality, and the use of logic, the art of non-contradictory identification. I mean, we learn about reality by looking at it, by forming concepts based on the things that we see, and then forming other concepts on the ideas that we formed. So you see birds and you form the concept birds, and you see cats and dogs and you form the concepts cats and dog, and then you put those ideas together, bird, cat, dog, and you get the concept animal, and so on. And this is how our conceptual knowledge is based on and derived from reality. But there are no facts to support the idea that there's some guy in the sky whose orders we must obey. And acceptance of faith as a means of knowledge is really aiding the enemy who wants to kill you. So Westerners have got to muster the courage to challenge faith as such, which of course means challenge religion as such. We need to launch and sustain a fundamental philosophic war. This is not a political battle. This is a moral and philosophical battle. It's a moral and philosophic revolution that we need to wage, and it's all about reason versus faith, and that's the fundamental. Now, the heart and soul of this revolution is Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, which is a philosophy of reason and egoism and individualism and individual rights and capitalism. I mean, that's just sort of the broad categories that her philosophy covers. To learn more about Rand's ideas, I encourage you to read especially her book Atlas Shrugged and her nonfiction book The Virtue of Selfishness. You learn about her ideas directly from her. That's the best way to do that. To see objectivism applied to cultural and political issues of the day, read The Objective Standard and TOS blog, which can be found at theobjectivestandard.com. In any event, let's stop tolerating things that ought to be judged. Let's judge them. Let's use our concepts correctly. Respecting rights means respecting rights. Refusing to judge means refusing to judge. And the real meaning of tolerance is that, refusal to judge. That's it for today's episode of Reason at Large. If you would like me to address another question, or if you have a question you'd like me to address in a future episode, send it to me at cbiddle@theobjectivestandard.com, and I will take a look. I can't promise I'll answer every question, but I read them all, and I try to answer the ones that I think are most interesting to a broad audience. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy your day.